Solutions. I and the Board of Directors for Commuting Solutions welcome you to this second only virtual meeting in the 20-year history of our organization. And we're very happy you're here. Thanks so much for allowing us to convene our coalition surrounding the transportation and mobility issues in the Northwest Metro region. This is great to have you all here. It's fantastic to have such a committed group of members. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. Please mute yourself. I know everybody that I can see already is. As I said, please add your name and organization to the chat so we know who's here. We'll be providing question and answer opportunities throughout the morning, and that will be done through the chat as well, and then Audrey will funnel those to our speakers at the end of each presentation, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to ask questions. We're recording the meeting for future use, so just have that in mind as you're in front of your cameras. And at least, last but not least, please stick around until the very end because we have 3 fabulous door prizes to give out to 3 lucky folks here who have joined us today, and I'm looking forward to that myself. This is the 3rd quarter membership meeting made possible by our 2020 sponsors. Colorado High Performance Transportation Enterprise, Elevations Credit Union, Google, and RTD. The rest of our 2020 sponsors are included in the sponsorship slideshow, which will be shown again at the end of the meeting. Special welcome to the folks who have never joined us before. In case you are new to us, Commuting Solutions is a nonprofit organization that serves the transportation management serves as the Transportation Management Organization, the TMO, for the Northwest Metro region. It's a role we have proudly served for over 22 years to convene public and private sector stakeholders regarding the regional transportation needs. And again, thank you for joining us today. We're going to start first with RTD Accountability Committee overview and transportation conversations for the 2021 legislative session, kind of the heavy stuff right up front. Commuting Solutions is pleased to have with us again, thank you both by the way, you're so reliable, State Senator Faith Winter and State Representative Matt Gray. We began the year, if many of you folks were there, in January before we thought that 2020 was going to be such an interesting set of challenges. Together with a breakfast, a legislative breakfast, we had high hopes that the legislative session would have positive outcomes for transportation. Instead, things didn't turn out quite that way. We were pleased to have the governor's office, the State House, and RTD reach an agreement to create a new RTD Accountability Committee. And now more than ever, this collaboration to ensure RTD is in the best position to succeed is needed. So we thank Senator Winter, Representative Gray for your leadership in creating that committee. We're also interested in hearing your conversations regarding the state's ability to increase transportation funding at some point in the future, maybe in 2021, and anything you can add on that will be great. Welcome and good morning, Senator Winter and Representative Gray.
Good morning. We're very excited to be here. Matt, do you want to go first or do you want me to go first?
You go first.
Okay, excellent. So a couple quick updates. Our accountability committee is up and running. And thank you to Dr. Cog. I know Dr. Cog's here for taking on the administration of the accountability committee, which really allowed us to ensure that this is a truly independent committee, which was important to both Representative Gray and myself and the governor. We worked really hard to make sure that we were appointing folks from all over the region, that the folks had a diverse background, and were diverse geographically. And so I think we hit a really good balance. And ultimately, we brought together the accountability committee for a whole variety of reasons. So clearly, Matt and I represent the US 36 corridor. And we feel very strongly and passionately about the transportation solutions along US 36. However, it was not just about the train, right? And from Denver to Boulder and Longmont. It's also about other problems that we were seeing. We had other local governments that had frustrations with RTD. There was issues about hiring drivers, maintaining drivers, and we also want to recognize that there was new leadership at RTD that really wanted to make some changes and see some, and really use this accountability as a platform for help and getting more creative solutions. Elise Jones and Crystal Murillo are co-chairs of the Accountability Committee, and I know that they are very accessible and more than happy to talk to anyone that wants to talk with them. We have expertise on the Accountability Committee, from human resources to economic development, to management to local governments. And so we think that there's a balance to really go through that. And obviously RTD was in the news this morning with some of the recommendations that they've been making on staffing and budget. And this is an example of exactly why we created an accountability committee, because there's local governments on there, and you all are making the same hard choices right now during COVID about budgets, about how to staff during an economic downturn, about difficult decisions, and you're represented there. We have HR director that's at the table, economic development folks that can talk about the economy. And so this is a perfect example of why we created the accountability committee, was to review those recommendations, to weigh in on those recommendations, to offer advice or alternatives or an agreement on those recommendations. And so I look forward to seeing what the accountability committee has to say on that. And then ultimately this comes down to funding, both for RTD, public transit across the state, and our transportation infrastructure. And unfortunately last year, Representative Gray and I were working towards having a transportation funding solution that was going to be bipartisan in nature and move forward. And we were getting there. We had a lot of people at the table. We had bipartisan folks at the table, and we were getting both sides to come closer, which meant we were having Democrats that were agreeing that they could have a general fund commitment to transportation. We were having Republicans saying that they could have an investment in public transit and climate solutions. And unfortunately, when COVID hit, those negotiations were halted. But we know that just because we are living in a pandemic doesn't mean our transportation infrastructure needs have gone away. And we're going to have to continue those conversations, but it's going to be new on how that looks. And first and foremost, I think probably what impacts our conversations around funding the most is the ballot initiative on fees. If that initiative on fees passes, I think a transportation deal is going to be the first victim. So if you care about transportation funding, you should tell people to vote no on that ballot initiative. It's just going to take a tool that we will have to use to get to a transportation funding solution away. And that's going to be extremely difficult to get around. And so I think we have to see what happens in November before we have further, more serious conversations. But ultimately, we need to continue this conversation. It depends on that ballot initiative. It depends on the state budget and economic recovery. Is it going to be slow and arduous to come back? Is it going to be quick? Is it going to be intermittent? These are all questions we don't know yet. And we will have to answer those questions as we continue forward. However, as we continue forward, we have to have these conversations, which means we have to talk about different types of fees, which comes out of Senate Bill 239 from the 2018 session. Continuing talking about general fund, and continue talking about any way we can have new revenue. And so we will continue that conversation. We want to have that conversation with you. And so I'll turn it over to my fantastic partner on all things, including transportation funding and RTD, Representative Gray.
Thank you. Excuse me, Senator Winter. I agree with everything that Senator Winter just said. I would add on the RTD front, we think this is a really good time to have this committee in place, and we're really excited about it. We're glad that we got to work with RTD on it, but again, they're just in a spot right now, and I don't know, maybe there's an RTD presentation in this meeting. I apologize, I have not looked at the agenda. That's really challenging. Like a lot of folks there, they have a budget shortfall like a lot of governments do right now, including ours, including the state, but also are bringing in a brand new CEO, which on one level is exciting and another level is really daunting. It's a really challenging time to start as a CEO of an organization. So we're really glad that we added that extra layer of both accountability, but also just expertise, folks who can, take a second look at everything that's going on and add advice, because again, it's been a rocky few years, and we're just excited to have a structure in place to make sure that with the resources that we actually do have, the best decisions are going to be made. On the transportation funding side, all of our problems got worse. We were already facing a tough situation, and all of our problems got worse. Senator Winter touched on the enterprise initiative, which I think is a big challenge, is a real threat to this, because as much as that's a statute, and I think even if it did pass, you could do something, the political will to do something could get drained really, really fast anyway, where we didn't have a ton of political will anyway. But also, a huge part of any deal that we were negotiating, and there were different camps that were going on, it involved some money coming out of the general fund. And that's, from Senator Winter and I are both Democrats. To bring Republicans to the table on transportation stuff has always taken general fund. Their general position has been general fund is the only thing that they want to spend. They might come to the table on something or the other if we offer a bunch of general fund. Well, right now the general fund is shot. We were supposed to be in a Tabor surplus situation beginning of this year, and then we had to drop the budget by $3 billion or so. And we have some CARES Act money that came in to offset some of the cuts we would have had to make to education, or actually to offset those cuts. We had to make these giant cuts to education, but we got backfilled. Anybody who's watching knows the next layer of that, the next step past this year on aid from the federal government is very uncertain right now, if at all. And so our general fund right now is shaping up to be in a lot worse shape than it was last year. And the odds of us pulling out, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for transportation are almost nil, because we're just going to be talking about where we're cutting from. And so that's going to make it hard too. So between the enterprise initiative and the lack of general fund money, two of the things that would have been some like our most important tools in getting a bipartisan deal are in real danger right now. And so we're in worse shape now. We weren't in great shape on January 1st, and we're in worse shape now than we were before as far as reaching a global statewide transportation deal. But the other thing to think about and to keep in people's minds, so there's some uncertainty around there, and we won't know until we see how the federal government acts and how the election goes. We're kind of in I don't think there'll be big developments between now and November, but that's less than, the election day, which is now less than 2 months away anyway. But the other thing to think about is a bill that Senator Winter and I introduced and then, killed ourselves post-COVID, which was to expand the authority for regions to act on their own in transportation. And I think it's a serious conversation for the folks in this group to at least have on a planning basis, a contingent basis, I should say, because the odds are getting longer all the time. And what is not likely to happen is let's assume for a moment that the Democrats can keep control of both houses of, both chambers, or even it's actually worse if they don't, but no matter what, we don't have the tools for a deal right now. Necessity is the mother of invention, and maybe the dam will burst and we'll get to it. But otherwise, what is not likely is that if Democrats control everything, that we will pass something that's really audacious with respect to transportation funding, knowing that we're going to get politically assailed for it, and we're still going to build up the infrastructure in the districts of the people who are politically assailing us for it. It's not likely to happen. And so if we don't go that way, if we can't get a bipartisan deal, there's a chance that we shift more to a regional approach to this, that we basically tell regions look, if you want to invest, let's give you the tools to invest in your, in your local and regional transportation systems without telling you, no, you've got to wait to do that until we actually get this consensus, because it's been hard. And as I said before, and as Senator Winter said, we've lost some of our tools, or we may lose some of our tools in the future. So what a regional plan would look like, I think, is just as important of something to think about as, you know, how you can help at the state level. We're going to keep working for sure. But, you know, just our odds of success were never that great to start out with. And it's a lot harder right now. And so if you're a, you know, a local leader and you're like, well, we'd like to start investing in the next few years, I think the odds of doing regional projects are probably just as likely, if not more likely, than, you know, helping to guide where the new state money is going to come from. And so I mean, the answer is we don't know, but it's also something that I would think about, because, you know, once we knew that once COVID hit, we abandoned that idea, not because of anything changed, you know, in the political nature. It's because you know, COVID hit and it just didn't make a lot of sense. But absent a new breakthrough at the state level, or, you know, the mythical unicorn of giant federal infrastructure spending bill that everybody always talks about but it has never come, it may be, for those of you who are like, look, here are the projects we need to get done, here are the corridors we need to be investing in sooner rather than later, I would say take an all of the above planning approach, because we've got a lot of uncertainty. But it may be that both the federal government doesn't come through and the state government doesn't come through, and it may be, you know, regional teamwork that saves the day ultimately, as far as getting getting those investments made. That's about all I have. Other than that, everything was great.
Yeah, there's hardly any way to follow up with a question, because it's just it would be pure conjecture to ask when you think this is, you know, we can put our head above water and start looking at the future. We're still dealing with the onslaught and you know, the flood right now, right? I guess for a sense of grounding for everybody on the call who might not have seen the announcement from RTD late yesterday, they said that they will be facing $166 million shortfall in 2021, currently carrying 40% of the pre-COVID passengers, yet they have 100% of the workforce still employed. And so they have been predicting that they might have to reduce budgeted positions 25 to 30% in order to balance things. And so we'll be hearing from RTD's board members in just a few minutes. I wanted to see, Audrey, if anyone had any questions for Representative Bray or Senator Winter.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. I have a question, but I just did see one come in from George Twig from Boulder County, and his question is, are there any updates or next steps on the recommendations that came out of Senator Winter's Senate Bill 19-239 study committee?
There's no specific updates that clearly listed a whole variety of different fees that we could enact that really look towards the future of transportation and what that looks like. So for example, we want to make empty autonomous vehicles very expensive. The last thing we want is a bunch of empty autonomous vehicles running around. You don't want to be stuck on US 36 and in traffic and the car in front of you is empty and the car behind you is empty and you're wondering where all the traffic came from. And so really that was, Senate Bill 239 was designed to look at different fees, also look at the future of transportation, including climate impacts. And we did that, and I think we'll see what happens this year. I think the implementation of those recommendations need to be part of a larger package, because just doing one-off fees and the political capital to do one-off fees aren't going to solve anything, and I think need to be part of a larger package.
Thank you, Senator Winter, and thanks to you both for your service to our region and to Colorado. We greatly appreciate your leadership. One question I had for the two of you regarding the RTD Accountability Committee is, what is the structure for the committee to interface regarding decisions that the RTD Board of Directors will be making? such as their 2021 budget, the FISA account that's dedicated to completing fast tracks, et cetera? Thank you.
Sure, I'll start and then let Senator Winter clean up the things they get wrong. You know, the Accountability Committee has its own, it basically set its own jurisdiction. They have access to everything that to the documents and to the meetings, and there are ex officio board members from the RTD board on the committee for that interface. But what they don't have, they get to the way the structure is set up is not that they review every decision that RTD makes and, you know, does a thumbs up or thumbs down on everything that either the board or the staff makes. Their charge is to take a holistic look at everything and see what areas of concern they might have, see what recommendations they might make. And then the charge to what the board is required to do, what RTD is required to do, is to make a public response to any recommendation that they make. So if they take a look at like the FISA account decision, for example, and say, no, we would recommend you do that, you do it differently. They can't overrule the RTD board, but the RTD board and the RTD as an organization is committed to either saying, yes, we accept your recommendation, or here's the reason that we're not doing it, but doing that publicly. So that's sort of what it looks like. They're not, you know, they're not looking over RTD's shoulder about every single decision that they make. They don't have those kind of resources. Their charge is to look at the system overall and see where they think there should be either structural changes, decisional, you know, different decisional changes. And then there's a mechanism where they make recommendations directly to RTD, that RTD either has to say, yes, we accept your recommendation, or give a public explanation as to why or why not they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, and I'll just add in that the Accountability Board does have opportunities for public comment, which I think could be entirely appropriate for this group to provide some public comment, either in writing or by showing up to their meetings, you know, asking them to weigh in on the FISA issue. And I think for US 36, I would encourage you to think about, right, how, because essentially if RTD does not use that money right now, you're basically telling RTD to lay off more people instead of using that money. And that's a really hard choice. And so, but at the same time, if we're using that money to support basic operations, that is again the North supporting RTD and sacrificing for RTD and not getting what we need. And so there's probably some conversation in the middle there that I think this corridor needs to have.
Thank you for the response to that. We did have another question come in from Councilmember Joan Peck from the city of Longmont. She asks, and this may be a question for the two of you, or perhaps for our two RTD board members who are going to be speaking shortly, but her question is there a legal question with taking Fast Track's FISA funds to use for base operations?
Well, okay. RTD can answer that also. And again, I used to be RTD's lawyer. I'm not RTD's lawyer now. I don't think so under the Fast Tracks question, because there's going to be plenty of money. What the Fast Tracks ballot question requires is that the money go to support the overall project, which is all of the lines, not just any particular line. So I don't think there are legal. I think that the account was a good initiative to try to actually, show some good faith about the future of the North Line. But as far as using the sales tax revenue that comes in under the Fast Tracks question, that money gets spent all over the place. And so if that's where the revenue came from, and again, maybe somebody from RTD can do better, but if that's where the money is coming from, is we've been making down payments out of there. Ultimately, the legal restrictions on that money are paying for the entire system, not paying for any particular line in the system. Because when the voters voted for Fast Tracks, they didn't, know for sure what was going to be constructed and when. And obviously, that it's not turned out well for us up here, but it is sort of the way at least the ballot question is structured.
Director Geisinger or Director Cook, would you like to take that quick questions just so that we can close that out, please?
The last question about whether there's a legal issue with taking fast tracks dollars.
Yes.
You know, Shelley may have an answer too, but I think that Representative Gray is right. That's my understanding. I do plan to talk some more to Heather McKillop, our CFO, about exactly what dollars go in and you know, what the restrictions. There's a fast tracks, there's a FISA agreement or a set of agreements that I haven't spent a lot of time with, but it's a good question. A number of people have asked it, and I think that Representative Gray's answer is correct, but we will be looking at it more.
Craig, those are all the questions that we have. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your questions. Very good ones. And Lynn, thank you for taking that quick one. I know that you'll have a lot more to say about these issues in just a little bit. Representative Gray, Senator Wender, thank you. I just want you to know how important it is to have you always with us at these meetings and bringing such a frank look at our situation. It's very, very helpful, and we appreciate it. Thank you for your partnership with us.
Thanks so much for having us on. And as always, right, we get some of our best ideas and solutions from people like you. And so as we're looking at RTD and transportation funding and all of these issues and the future of transportation, please stay in touch, give us all your policy ideas, and we look forward to talking more as we get ready for session after this election.
Yes, thank you so much. And I look forward to the pandemic ending and welcoming you all back to the First Bank field just as soon as we can get you back in there.
All right,
so much.
If you have to go homeschool your children, we understand, but please stay with us.
We do.
Like to.
We both do, yes.
All right, have a great day.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to cover Cdot's statewide plan and talk about the NAM's progress that we're making here in our area. At the August meeting, the Cdot Commission approved a statewide plan to address the mobility needs of Colorado. It included a 10-year project list of priorities. So we're pleased to welcome to Commuting Solutions the Cdot Commission Chairperson, Karen Stewart. Karen is also the Executive Director of a sister TMO, Smart Commute Metro North, whose service area is focused on the North I-25 corridor. Pleased to have with us again Rebecca White, Division Director of Transportation as well. Both Karen and Rebecca are going to provide us with an overview of this significant milestone for Cdot and how the project list supports the regional transportation priorities identified by us in our own Northwest Mobility Study, which we call NAMS. Karen Stewart, Rebecca White, welcome this morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
Thanks very much. I think we should probably have Rebecca. Yeah, let's have Rebecca go first and talk about the statewide transportation plan that the Transportation Commission has just adopted. We're very excited about this. It has some components in it that we've never had before, and I think you'll be pleased with the plan if you have a chance to go and look at it. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, and then I'll follow Rebecca with a quick overview of our green mobility plan that's ongoing. Thanks.
Great. Good morning again, everyone. It's always a delight to have a chance to speak to this group. You know, I can say there's probably no better day for a planner than when a significant effort gets formally adopted. I know probably many on this meeting who work in the sort of transportation planning world know how good that feels. So we are very happy to have in place a set of pretty important planning documents for the future of Cdot, the future of transportation in Colorado. But before I dive into that, I thought I might, if you could go to the next slide, just give you a quick update on where we are sort of overall planning and funding related. I will talk through the adoption of the statewide plan, and a significant part of what the sort of collection of planning documents that Cdot has is a 10-year list of projects. This was a really important outcome of about a year of outreach we did. We didn't want to just create this sort of long-term narrative vision, which is important work, but to have that without a very specific list of projects that we'd sort of refreshed as well. And so we were able to deliver a really great vision for the next decade. And that 10-year list assumed that the first 4 years would be fully funded by the Senate Bill 267 revenues. And then the out 6 years were unfunded, but they were our sort of highest priority projects that we would deliver on the heels of 267. So the good news is that even after COVID hit in full force on our state and our economy, we did receive the second tranche of the Senate Bill 267 dollars, which was about $500 million. And many of those projects are already out to add, and we'll be working really hard to deliver all those. But we have 2 more years we're still hoping on. So we're doing a lot of contingency planning on different scenarios. But really part of that is just making sure we have all the pieces in place, all the pre-work, whether that's right-of-way acquisition or environmental work, so that with every allocation of additional funding, hopefully years 3 and 4 of Senate Bill 267, we are positioned to keep delivering that list. Of course, we got hit by the COVID economic impact, as all the other state agencies did. The impact to us was about $62 million over a couple fiscal years. The good news there is that we are closing in on filling that gap. We were about 12 million short about a month ago, and our CFO is pretty optimistic that we will be able to reach the rest of that gap without really impacting our core programs, which is great. That was a tough hit for us, and we've been pretty creative in trying to fill that. So that's kind of just to give you a sense of where the economic situation is impacting the plan. And if I could get to the next slide, I'll kind of go into the plan. So I really look at our statewide plan as a series of 3 related documents. First is the 10-year vision I spoke to. This is our sort of lookout over a tangible time frame. We feel like most Coloradans can sort of get their arms around what the next 10 years might look at. And so this is has a specific list of projects along with laying out a set of priorities for the state, which includes really significant investments in asset management. We're making one of the most, probably the largest investment in our rural pavement condition in the state's modern history, and allocating about 25% of the funds to really fix our rural roads. This also brings in a lot of transit work and mobility hubs. So we are really happy with where this document came out and the ability of that project list to really reflect statewide priorities. So that's a key piece. And then the second component is we've got 10 rural transportation plans around Colorado, because those TPRs, the transportation planning regions, don't have their own planning staff like the MPOs. Cdot tends to take quite a bit of the lift in creating those planning documents. And we have 10 of those that reflect the objectives and the priorities around the state. So those are a really important piece of this. And then lastly, the statewide plan, the 2045 vision, which is more a narrative. And we even have and I'll talk about this later, talk a little bit about the fact that we are releasing a transportation plan, at least for the first time in our history and during a pandemic, which has fundamentally shifted the way people move. And that is an interesting place to be and to speculate about what 2045 will look like when our reality shifted so dramatically in the last 6 months. So if you could go to the next slide. So prior to the adoption of the plan, we had it out for public comment. We extended it for another 30 days, so a total of 60 days, just really reflecting the fact that a lot of people are really struggling right now, and we wanted to make sure that we had ample time for members of the public to take a look at this document. We also lost a lot of our kind of more traditional ways to engage with folks, including putting the plan in the libraries, presenting at meetings, at least in person. So we wanted to kind of extend that and make sure that we were able to reach people, and we really pushed to social media. We also were on about half a dozen Spanish radio shows, which was fantastic. We got a lot of good interaction there, and then looped back with a lot of our key stakeholders. Got about 100 comments, which is pretty good for a document like this. And if you go to the next slide, we sort of break these down into the 3 major priorities for Cdot: safety, mobility, and asset management. So the public weighed in on just the overall importance of safety, but interestingly, there was a couple specific comments on the dislike of roundabouts, which I can understand. On the mobility front, very interesting. We had a lot of people started beginning to talk about the importance of reducing VMT, which I think may have been sort of as a result of COVID and working from home and sort of a different relationship that we all kind of created with our car during that time. So I think that's an interesting development that came from the comments. And then if you go to the next slide, on asset management, this was a key focus of Cdot's planning. 50% of the projects, as I mentioned earlier, in the 10-year plan, get at improving our assets, and we seem to get a lot of encouragement for that focus, which is great. If you go to the next slide. So what that input meant is, some little bit of fixes here and there to the plan. We did emphasize the importance of Vision Zero. We are seeing a real uptick recently in pedestrian, bicycle fatalities, and most recently, motorcycle fatalities. That really seems to be happening a lot more during this COVID period, which is really unfortunate. So we stressed that a bit more. There were some language changes around making, acknowledging folks with disabilities and their ability to access the system, emphasizing some electrification work. So it was a really good set of input and allowed us to flag a few things in the plan. And if you go to the next slide, what I think is really interesting about, like I said, introducing a plan during this time frame is that it's really unclear right now what the future is for transportation in a lot of ways. That whether we will see the fundamental shifts that have happened during COVID on travel patterns, how that will play into the long term, if it's really going to change behavior, or if we will sort of end up right back where we were pre-COVID with lots of congestion and single occupancy trips in the metro area. Tell you right now, our travel numbers are about 10% down for vehicles mile traveled than they usually are. But on certain corridors, they're right back up to where they were pre-COVID. I-270 is one that is already pretty congested. I was out driving I-25 quite a bit over the last week, and that feels like it's getting back up there as well. So we remains to be seen. I think we're hopeful that some of the changes we saw during COVID, more work from home, will be permanent. But this is sort of one of the challenges of looking out at the long term during this period. And if you go to the next slide. Is it? Yep, thank you. But this is a living document. I think the worst thing for a planner is to work really hard on a plan and then stick it on the shelf and then take it back down in 4 years. That's not what we want to do. So we'll be having a lot of conversations with the Transportation Commission over the coming months on how we keep this alive, continue to reflect what's going on in our society, our state, and the evolving goals of our commission. And I think Chair Stewart will talk a bit about the commission's recent discussion of the importance of really tackling climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation. And so how we better reflect that in the plan will be one of the things that we talk about going forward. And then the last piece I'll touch on is accountability. If you could go to the next slide. It's really important to Cdot to make sure the public knows not that just we have a plan to deliver projects, but that we are delivering them well. So in the last couple of months, we've put up really a phenomenal dashboard that tracks every single project that receives Senate Bill 267 funding. And it's really from cradle to grave, that from the very time the project is initiated, the public can see how all the funding is distributed, how much that project cost, how much we're spending on pre-construction, how much we're spending to deliver the project, and where it is in its life cycle from early construction days through delivery. So this is a tool we're very proud of. I'd love in a future meeting to kind of do a walkthrough if that would be of interest. But this is a super important part of delivering a plan, is showing how we're doing that well. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Chair Stewart to kind of lead you in some of the other things that's going on at Cdot, and perhaps we can take questions afterward.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca. I really appreciate your overview of this plan. We're pretty proud of this plan. There's a lot of great tools in this plan. And one of the things that came out for our commission was this idea of reduction of VMT, or how does VMT impact the already problematic greenhouse gas problems that we have in Colorado that are just getting worse and will soon could be in nonconformity for air quality. And that comes with a number of mandated problems as well, mandated solutions to that. We like to think that our statewide plan really is a green plan for lots of reasons. We have mobility hubs in there, and we have other ideas in there that we have put into the plan that haven't been in the plan before. But I wanted to talk about the Transportation Commission's responsibility as to policies. So the Transportation Commission, 11 people appointed by the governor across the state of Colorado. And while our statutory requirements say that we have the final say on budget, and we have the final say in project prioritization, we also are required to be the policy arm of Cdot. And one of the policy pieces that we have added in response to some feedback that we got from the statewide plan, but in response also to the governor's important priority of making sure that that we do something about greenhouse gas issues that are coming up in Colorado for the reasons of more population and inversion factors, and you know, the incredible amount of greenhouse gas that transportation adds to the state. We want to talk about some tools that the Transportation Commission is now thinking about. So there's 3 buckets of this, really. Our potential action steps could include regulatory actions, changing some of the infrastructure like mobility hubs or managed lanes, consumer education, making sure people understand what transportation adds in impact to greenhouse gas, and initially fleet replacement at Cdot. We have a lot of vehicles, and talking about how do we replace those vehicles with vehicles that are more sustainable and greener. Infrastructure planning and projects, really, we're talking about, we have a criteria that we look at, and we're talking about how we can add that to our budgets, looking at the NEPA processes that exist now and how can those be tweaked or improved. Green construction in our projects and in things like our new Cdot building is a green constructed building. And multimodal funding, many of you know that we used Multimodal Options Fund to put in some grant projects that communities across Colorado could use to support multimodal options. And then we are also talking about how does land use in adjacent jurisdictions impact on our already congested highway systems and any roads that connect to jurisdictions and their land use. And then the human factors of, the managed lanes that we have looked at. We've done a managed lanes master plan that many of you weighed in on. What are those pricing strategies to encourage the use of managed lanes when congestion becomes overwhelming? And then voluntary mandatory transportation demand management tools. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Next slide, please. So talking about our mobile sources and vehicles, you can see this slide shows that there are a number of policy tools that we're looking at, and particularly things within Cdot that we can do. So funding our fleet turnover, developing infrastructure that would support zero emissions, and that is the grant programs like Charge Ahead Colorado, and talking about highway corridor projects like medium and heavy duty. Outreach is important, and we believe that workforce training is important in coming to this goal as well. Exploring business models for shared mobility and last mile. And we're not saying we're doing this alone. We're saying we'd like to implement pilots in collaboration with industry and local governments and DRCOG and other organizations to share best practices. And then leading by example, we're looking to be able to procure policies for the Mustang, which is our transit program that runs down I-25 and then also across 70. But we also have another program called Outrider, which are many buses that go into the rural areas of Colorado. And how do we fund vehicles that use cleaner fuels? And that's part of our strategy on the mobile sources vehicles. Next slide, please. In our infrastructure bucket, we're talking about projects and planning, and we're talking about using Cdot access control permits. This is one that will be of interest, I think, to many of you in local government. The current policy directive of 1601 is an access permit that new development applies for a permit for access to existing Cdot roads, intersections, and to date, there's not anything in 1601 that encourages land use that is amenable to transportation demand management strategies like transit connections or pedestrian first and last mile mobility, those kinds of things. So we're talking about projects and plannings that might now have access control permits into the policy 1601 in order to attain this goal. Expand efforts through NEPA to qualify and mitigate emissions for capacity expansion efforts, and that would be an update of Policy Directive 14 and 1901. And those policies will come in front of the Cdot Commission at some time in the future to talk about revisions to those guidance documents. We evaluate updates to the 10-year plan based on greenhouse goals. I think Rebecca made it pretty clear that it's a living document. This 10-year plan would have some updates through our policy directives to revise some of the guiding principles that we use in order to make our decisions. And we would develop a framework that would evaluate projects based on these revisions. Cdot green construction practices, and that would update a policy directive that would implement Cdot procurement practices. We'd continue to commitment of multimodal funding. I think you've seen in the past that we've used some of that multimodal transit funding in order to facilitate more transit and different sorts of transit. We, through the Department of Transit and Rail, within Cdot, to put some of that multimodal funding to use statewide. And we'd use Cdot research programs for new technologies and construction methods. And that would also update Policy Directive 14. And all of these policy directives in the next year will come in front of the Transportation Commission for discussion and approval for changes in those policy directives. Next slide, please. And the human factors, of course, behavior change. So those of you who know what Commuting Solutions does and Smart Commute does and Northeast Transportation, does, we are the TMOs that really encourage voluntary transportation demand management now. And last month at the Transportation Commission, Audrey DeBarris and Stuart Anderson came and gave an update on what the Denver Metro Region's TMAs do, how they have programming that encourages transportation demand management, and some of the best practices that happen within the Denver Metro region as an update to the Transportation Commission to let them know what is happening now and what can happen with an expansion of those programs. And the TC will be looking at updating some of the policy directives to continue to implement TDM grant programs, maybe enhance the programs that we get now. TDM programs through the Denver Metro region are funded by the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality funding that comes through DRCOG. There may be an opportunity to put more money into those grant programs. And some of the best practices then that happen within the Denver Metro region can be maybe applied in other areas throughout the state. I don't think there's any established transportation management organizations in other areas of the state, but that's a discussion that the Transportation Commission would like to have as well, and how could we encourage those kinds of organizations that work so well here in the Front Range. And then the last one is using managed lanes and tolls to control flat traffic flow. Many of the managed lanes now have the opportunity to change the toll based on the use of the general purpose lanes. And when traffic gets very bad, we can change those costs in order to encourage people to use managed lanes and get out of general purpose, or vice versa. And we can create the managed lane space for reliable transit as well. As you see on the US 36 corridor, Flatiron Flyer is able to use those managed lanes and have a very reliable trip from the Boulder area into the Denver area using managed lanes. So we're going to look at current and future expansion projects. As I said, we did a managed lanes master plan last year, and best practices from US 36 really has guided some of those decisions in where the new managed lanes would be. On I-25, we've just completed segment 3 for managed lanes, and we're working on managed lanes up to the north at Fort Collins and Loveland as well. So as Rebecca mentioned as well, COVID-19 has really impacted our whole system, and we're going to continue to look at this as we move forward in this effort that we have to make a more green mobility effort at Cdot. The next step for us is how we will implement these goals, and how we will fund those goals. And this is not an overnight program for us, but it's a thoughtful and complex opportunity, though, for us to look at how do we take what our responsibility is at Cdot, providing mobility, to make it a much more green effort on our part. And so stay tuned. We'll have more on that. I think at our September meeting, we're going to talk a little more about the implementation of some of these policy directives, and how do we fund some of these policy directives. Thanks very much for your attention on this. I thought that this would be an interesting topic for all of us in the Northwest metro area, as many people sitting at this table on this meeting today have been very proactive in looking at green mobility. So take questions, I think, after this. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen and Rebecca. I know we do have maybe a time for one quick question. There are other questions coming in, and maybe we can forward those to you that we don't have a chance to answer right now. So maybe we can take one question, Audrey.
Sure. I'd like to ask the question brought to us by Malcolm Fleming. He's the town manager for the town of Erie. Your presentation mentions greenhouse gas goals and support for rail transit, especially on the Front Range, since rail generates the least greenhouse gas per passenger mile of all modes except walking and biking. Please elaborate on what specific actions the plan supports to make expanded rail transit service on the Front Range a reality. Good question.
An easy one. Thanks, Malcolm.
Well, I'm happy to attempt an answer to that, and that is that we're looking at Cdot, we're looking at Front Range Rail, and we'll have an update on that in October. I think Randy Grauberger from Front Range Rail Commission came and spoke to your group or the US 36 mayors and commissioners just recently and gave an update on the efforts there. So that's in partnership with Cdot, and that's certainly something that within our ability to add into our toolbox is the Front Range Rail Commission's suggestions and recommendations. We at Cdot, we often get confused with RTDs. So we do a lot of town hall meetings, and there's never one of those meetings that I don't get asked why Cdot isn't building the rail to Longmont. And I think it's confusing for a lot of people that Cdot isn't RTD and RTD isn't Cdot, and yet we have a coexistence in many ways, like on US 36 when the transit travels on the highway, and many of the projects on I-25 have a component of, and State Highway 7 have a component of collaboration and funding from both agencies. Rebecca, do you have a better answer than me? Because I don't think I really answered Malcolm's question, except to say that we're looking at state rail.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Stewart. I think the comment on Front Range Rail is a good one. I hope many of you saw the kind of series of articles in the Denver Post and the Colorado Public Radio on the recent modeling work that we've been doing to help the Front Range Rail Commission. I would say, though, in the near term, I think part of what Cdot can do is help build the ease of transit and the access to transit, and so that, should rail become a reality, we have a lot more people who are willing to take transit and see that as just part of their life and how they move about. So to that end, I think the mobility hubs will be a really key development, and there's a heavy emphasis on that in the plan and quite a few dollars. And what we're looking at along the I-25 corridor is really activating these hubs about every 10 miles. And those could be, future stops for rail as well. But in the interim, they're the spot where the buses can come and stop, where we can have people charge their cars, park their bike, but really start to build that awareness and access and ease of transit, part of how we move around. So that's the only piece I would add is that we're not waiting. We're continuing to do all we can over the short term to be a part of the solution there.
Thank you
Wonderful.
both. And then I know we need to move along to get to the rest of our agenda, but I just did want to thank the Cdot Commission for the approval of the transportation plan and the 10-year project list in August. In that was included $130 million for regional projects that are identified in the Northwest Area Mobility Study, including State Highway 119, State Highway 7, US 287, and Colorado 42 or Highway 42. So we greatly appreciate this designated funding for our region. Thanks so much.
And have a great morning, both of you. Thanks for always being here with us. And we could dedicate an entire day to just CDOT and the great work that folks are doing. Thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate it. We're going to move very quickly into RTD. The discussion will now be brought by Lynn Geisinger, one of our former board members of Commuting Solution, representing District O for RTD, as well as Shelley Cook, representing District L. I don't really need to set up any questions. I know you folks have a lot of information to deliver to us today, especially after yesterday's announcement. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you all. I'm Shelley Cook, as mentioned, the director for District L, and Lynn and I are going to split this presentation. I'll start off and could go ahead and move into the next slide. Just by way of introduction, actually, you all have already sort of teed us up nicely. Really appreciate that, Chair. You had talked about the $166 million shortfall that just now you're seeing information about some of the recommendations of the internal task force. And what I'd like to do is provide some of the background and particulars for that number and what we're doing to address it, or some of the early process and outcomes. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lynn Geisinger to talk about the particulars, especially as they affect the US 36 corridor. So if you could go ahead and change to the next slide. Okay, so I'm talking financial impacts from COVID. And this has perhaps been covered in other venues, but I'm going to recap it just to land on that $166 million. It's hit two of our major revenue streams, fare collections being the first one. And you may have heard that total ridership with the shutdown dropped about 70%, still down about 60%. But to show you how that looks on particular routes, I've got a chart here that shows ridership for 4 of the rapid transit corridors in the north since the start of the year. So the blue is the A line, the orange is the Flatiron Flyer, the gold is the G line, and the gray is the B line. So you can see that January and February, pre-shutdown, we had pretty healthy levels on all of those. Those are in thousands. And then, of course, in March, shutdown mid-month, the numbers plunged. They bottomed out in April and started to climb back in May and June. My understanding is that July numbers, that's with the resumption of fare revenue collections. July numbers were about steady, but anecdotally, August is increasing. In spite of that, we're still collecting only about 53% of our budget for fare collections year to date. So there's a pretty significant hit there. And of course, in April, folks are familiar, we cut service to 40% to basically Saturday levels with some adjustments for things like, areas that had pretty heavy use, had lots of people who relied on transit, or where we were having trouble maintaining social distancing and so forth. Next slide, please. Second area of financial impact is the sales and use tax. So As with ridership, the sales and use tax revenues fell pretty dramatically through spring, and we've seen some recovery this summer. The chart shows the monthly year-to-date collections versus what we budgeted for that point in time. So we've got January and February actually were a little bit above budget, and then with the March shutdowns and the change in behavior, as everybody's noted with travel, we saw pretty significant drop. So it bottomed out in May and started climbing back up again in June. And from what I understand, July looks to continue, or, you know, there's a delay of a month or so in getting the numbers, but July looks to continue that. Now, the problem is sales and use tax revenues are a larger share of our budget. They're 57%, you know, by portion of the total revenues that we collect. So any change in this is really felt across the board. We've received the $232 million in CARES Act funding. That's a big deal. And it was what we used, as mentioned, to maintain full staffing, even with the reduced service levels. But in that regard, the staff asked with that money, and in conjunction with some service or some cost reductions we made mid-year, to bring at least $25 million into 2021, you know, hoping to cushion us somewhat against what we see as a shortfall then. We're planning for $166 million, and that's in significant part a function of the Leeds School of Business projected reduced sales and use tax and fare revenues. And, you know, there's so much uncertainty that, you know, in spite of some improved outcomes since that forecast was made, we're holding to that number. We don't know what's going to happen with the virus this fall. As mentioned, the economic recovery is uncertain, the time frame, the extent, what happens in Congress with any potential fiscal stimulus package or infrastructure, and of course the elections. So with so much uncertainty, the staff are holding to that number. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of that 166, I've got a pie chart here from the adopted budget. And if you take out the parts, this is RTD's operating expenses, about $740 million. If you take out the two pieces of the pie for other administrative and planning and capital, that leaves the more direct operational costs. And if you tally those, that's about 511, let me get to my number right quick here, about 511.5 million. That 166 million equates to about a third of that. So about a third of our operating budget is what we're talking about having to reduce. And further, Leeds projects that we won't recover to pre-COVID levels of revenue collections until some out year, like 2023, maybe even later. And so again, there's a lot of uncertainty. As a result, the interim general manager, Paul Ballard, formed the Internal Fiscal Response Task Force, whose recommendations are just now, you're seeing right now, both in the press and in our own communications. And the board, for our part, established some COVID budget reduction principles, the kinds of things that we wanted to guide that task force's work as it developed recommendations for addressing that shortfall. Things like, we didn't want service cuts to be the primary response. We wanted to show employees that we value them. We wanted to see some creativity. We wanted outreach to stakeholders and to tap the expertise of the accountability committee. So we are looking forward to that in terms of review. Next slide. Okay, so you're starting to see some of those recommendations. Board members have had a chance to sit down one-on-one, but we haven't actually seen all the particulars, so hold that in mind. And we haven't had a chance to talk about it as a group, but we know that there are administrative costs of all kinds factored into their recommendations. the major part in terms of dollars come with salary reductions in the form of furloughs, and they're done on a tiered basis. That was something the board early on had hoped for, and so glad to see that they had incorporated that. There are layoffs, and they might total up to 25 or 30% of our operations and administrative complement. All of that is still being finalized. And again, just re-emphasizing that one caveat, the forecasted revenues were from an earlier leads modeling. And some of what we're seeing since then point to a bit better performance, but with all the uncertainty, we're still focusing on that. But one advantage we have right now is that we're not going to adopt our budget for 2021 when these recommendations would really sort of, the rubber would hit the road for another couple of months. So it'll give us a little bit more of a time padding to identify what's happening. And then one last note, the reserves, this hasn't gained a lot of attention, but I wanted to focus on it for a second. The board has given sort of a tentative okay to utilize our reserves and leave a 1 month cushion at least. Well, that gives me the shivers in a way, because GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, recommends 2 months. Our own goal was 3 months. With all the uncertainty that we see, the one thing that, and this is in addition to the other considerations about retaining the FISA balance, the one piece of information that gives me some comfort in going to that 1 month for the duration is that the FISA in an emergency could suffice too. But that's in addition to the other considerations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lynn, who can talk more about the FISA, the issues surrounding the use of that balance, and service levels and our plan for the midterm financial plan and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Shelley's been doing a great job chairing our finance committee. We talked today, we titled our program Challenges and Changes, and I think there are a lot of good changes coming, but this week it feels like challenges and challenges with the FISA issues, and yesterday, of course, with the news about the layoffs, that they're expecting something around 635 layoffs. This is, again, a result of this internal task force that was, Bruce Abel was heading up. It was a small group of staff. They've been discussing it with the board just in the last few days. And there are a lot of other cuts of all sorts. And as Shelley said, we are working to try to keep the focus from being cutting service. Unfortunately, the layoffs are brutal. They're really hard, and we're hopeful that maybe we can end up with something less. They won't happen for a bit here. I think they have to do a disparate impact study and some other things to sort of look at the numbers and figure out what moves forward. There'll also be furloughs of remaining staff, salary freezes, all kinds of other cuts. The letter that Paul Ballard sent out yesterday summarizes all of those, and perhaps, Audrey, I could get that to you and you could post it. I'm sure it's being posted other places, CPR and other things. Next slide, please. So the changes that are coming up are coming to the board in 2 ways. One is approving the midterm financial plan, and that includes a lot of these decisions, the numbers with projections for the layoffs and the other cuts that are being made. And then the other big decision is the January run board for service changes. And one thing that a number of us are looking at and is slowing down some of these long-term decisions. With COVID, with all the uncertainty, as Shelley went through, we have this number of 166 million that we're solving for, and that's the leads number. But already, the sales and use tax may be coming in differently, and the midterm financial plan is typically a 6-year plan. It currently is a 6-year plan. We have suggested, well, the board has voted and staff has agreed to pause Reimagine, at least for several months. And then the MTFP, we're discussing the possibility of only passing it for 2 years. That may depend on how it comes back to us in terms of some of the particular issues that I'll talk about in a minute. And then with the January service changes, what we're in now is a pandemic plan. And if it becomes a January run board, it becomes the new normal. And actually, Shelley had the good idea that, and I think it has good support on the board, that this should not be the new normal. What we need to be passing is a second pandemic plan with a specific end date. The one that's been discussed is perhaps September. So that will be coming back to the board shortly. Next slide, please. January service changes. You know, everything is up in the air. The current plan is a 40% reduction from pre-COVID, as Shelley said, and the January service changes are intended to continue that 40% reduction, but to move it around. You know, we still have a number of routes, Colfax, Broadway, Federal, a number of Denver routes that, and there are others, but they're basically carrying essential workers and people who really rely on transit. And we've been running extra board buses that could fill in if they started to go over the social distancing requirements of 15 on a regular bus and 20 on a larger bus. But with the with some of the staff reductions, there will be fewer of those. So it's an attempt to move things around. And it will affect Boulder County. I know that some of you in various local governments here have seen some ideas about what might be done, what the changes might look like in Boulder County and in the Northwest Corridor. I did speak with Jesse Carter yesterday, who runs our service group, and he was saying he thinks that they may not need to do as much changing as they thought at first, which I think is hopeful. It's a you know, anytime you make changes, it's a tough way to go. And he said he's looking to see, as he put it, if the juice is worth the squeeze. So that's good. You know, in Boulder County, our ridership numbers are still largely single digits. I think the AB is getting, you know, 5 or 6 riders per bus. The Flatiron Flyer is picking up, but still, I think typically under the, you know, the 20 limit by a fair amount. And other buses like the Skip, I think the Skip is getting 18 boardings an hour on, you know, several buses. So, but these are January changes, and they're the open questions here are the open questions everywhere, but maybe even stronger here. What happens when CU's back in session? I haven't seen numbers yet of what's happened so far, but CU is only partially back in session now. So it's not, you know, what will January look like? What will April look like next year? Those are all big questions. What happens when BBSD goes back? So those are some of the questions. And that's why I think some of us would like to see this as a temporary pandemic plan and not something that from which the future is built. Next slide, please. FISA. There are 2 different revenues streams or pools that staff has looked at in terms of cutting this $166 million. And one is the FISA corpus that has collected since 2012. It's about $120 million now. And the other is the annual contribution to fund FISA, and that tends to run 17, 18, 19 million a year. The board, it says original board decision. I think it was just a straw poll, but the board's leaning as a whole was utilize the FISA contribution, stop making contributions. That was not supported by many of us up here, but that was the overall agreement. But they said, do not use the existing FISA balance. Things changed possibly some last week. The staff looking at various ways to hit the 166 million. And again, for the MTFP, it's money going forward for the next 6 years. So they brought the idea to the board of, should we move the Highway 119 funding from 2023 to 2027. And I am very glad to say that the board rejected that idea. Again, it's straw poll. It was a study session. Audrey did a nice job of giving us some very specific numbers about all of the other investments in this area that rely on the RTD $33 million, the $40 million from Cdot, funding from or the application for a build grant for Longmont, for Hover Road and the Diagonal, the study that's being done on revenue and traffic. At this point, a lot of funding that relies on Highway 119, and the board said, no, that should stay in 23. We have too many things relying on it there. But 3 people said that money should come from FISA for Highway 119. They joined a number of other people who had already said, use all of FISA. You know, and it's a tough decision, you know, like I say, when jobs are at issue. But FISA is, as Shelley said, it's important for a number of things. One is for the commitment to the North. And it's, again, it's not just a Northwest Rail fund. It is to finish all the projects. And there are 3 others, I think, corridors that aren't finished. But, you know, it's viewed as a sort of a important corpus for up here. But it's also an important piece as a backup reserve, since we're going with lower reserves, and potential funding if we get, if we need local funding to match infrastructure, an infrastructure bill that might come in the near future. So one of the things that we are suggesting is looking at just passing a 2-year midterm financial plan. That would leave the next 4 years basically as they are. It would leave Highway 119 in 2023. And there's several reasons for that. One is just that there is so much uncertainty that trying to plan for 6 years out, it's really hard. It's hard in any time, but it's really hard right now. And we're getting the new CEO. We have, you know, just a lot of change going on. So that's a possibility. It kind of depends on what comes back to us in the next week. Next slide, please. And we are looking at a lot of change, and this one I think is a very exciting one. Deborah Johnson will be the first woman to lead RTD as general manager, CEO in its history. In addition to the video that all of our finalists put out that many of you watched, the board spent 2.5 hours in 2 interviews talking with each of our finalists. And Deborah Johnson is a very impressive person. She has a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience. And I think that one of the things that many of us were impressed is she talks a lot about being a person in the people business and the importance of bringing in the community, working with our stakeholders. Obviously, that's an area that needs strengthening. You know, RTD, I think in many ways has lost its brand over the last few years for a variety of reasons, but one of them is not engaging as well as we need to be. And that's, I guess, the other reason for some of the pause that we're pushing for is just any discussion about FISA, 119, all of those things. As we've said repeatedly, these need to be socialized, they need to be negotiated, they need to be talked about with our stakeholders, and that is not a short-term process. We need more time to do that. But Deborah Johnson begins probably, I think it will probably be around the first week of November. We're still negotiating the contract, but I'm hopeful that will work out. So that's all I have. I'm assuming we might have some questions. The timeline for some of this, the MTFP comes back to, where's my timeline? There's a study session next week, and then on the 22nd in the Finance Committee, we'll be looking at specifics and adopting it, and then the following week the board would adopt it on September 29th. The service changes will come to the board on September 22nd, Ops Committee, and then to the full board on October 27th with some time for public meetings and discussion in between. So I would join Representative Gray in encouraging you. I think they were talking about, or maybe it was Senator Winter talking about getting involved with public comment and with the accountability committee. You know, I think keeping that going with the board and the staff as well. I know the MCC has been doing that for this region. And I think this is a great time for people to be involved with that. Thanks, happy to take questions.
Lynn and Shelley, that's just fantastic information. Thank you for covering all of that. It's so much to cover. We do have time for one question, but can we do one in a minute? Because we're already at 26 after the hour. I don't want to run over for everybody else. Do we have one, Audrey?
Yeah, real quick, Councilmember Joan Peck asks, is RTD collecting tax from online sales per the Wayfair decision back in October of 2018?
I can respond to that. We are, and actually that was one of the silver linings with all the online ordering and delivering. That was one thing that helped to keep our sales tax revenues up higher than they would have been probably. Lynn?
Lynn, yeah, okay.
I don't
Lynn,
have
were you going to add to that?
No, I don't.
Okay,
I'm
okay.
sorry, my phone was ringing, so.
It's all right, thank you. Thanks so much, both of you. You are so committed to our region. We really appreciate that you're looking out for us. And Lynn, being a former board member for Commuting Solution, we're especially happy that she's involved in this as well. Continuing with the RTD discussion, there is a board vacancy, and Elise Jones, Boulder County Commissioner, would love to tell us about that and how maybe someone can run for that position. Elise.
Thank you, Craig. And I'll be quick because we're running out of time. So good to be here with you all this morning. As you all know, RTD Director Judy Lubau is termed out at the end of this year, as are several of the rest of us. And I don't know if you're on the call, Judy, but let me take the opportunity to thank you for your 8 years of service. Next slide. Judy's district, next slide after that. Judy's district is District I, which covers eastern Boulder County, which includes portions of Longmont, largely east of Hoover, and then Lafayette, Erie, Broomfield, and then some small parts of unincorporated Adams and Weld counties. And the one candidate who attempted to make the ballot to fill this seat failed to collect enough valid signatures, so there's nobody on the November ballot. And state law says that when there's a vacancy that occurs in an RTD board seat that represents more than one county, the Board of County Commissioners from the county with the largest number of eligible voters in the district is charged with filling the vacancy. And in this case, that's Boulder County. So RTD sent us a letter asking us to fill this vacancy. Specifically, they asked us to do it by the first week of November so that that person can participate in the RTD director training and onboarding that's scheduled to begin right after the election. So we have designed a process that we hope is inclusive and transparent with ample opportunity for public and stakeholder input. Next slide. So our proposed vacancy process is as follows. We're planning on sending out a public announcement next Monday, September 14th, outlining the process and requesting that any interested parties submit a letter of application by September 28th. And anybody who's an elector in District I can apply. They can be in Boulder County, Broomfield, Adams, Weld, as long as they're in the District I district. So in their letter of interest, we're asking candidates to explain their expertise and experience, how it would benefit District I and the RTD board, why they want to serve on the board, and what goals they have for their service there. And then finally, their ridership on the RTD system. The public announcement is also going to include a link to our website. This is where you all come in, where the public and stakeholders can fill out an online survey regarding the characteristics that they think are important for the commissioners to use in selecting the next District I director, and any questions you think we should ask the candidates when we interview them. And that input's going to be due by September 30th. We will review all of the applications and determine a slate of finalists by October 5th. We will then conduct interviews with the finalists. We will videotape these interviews, and we're going to post these this sounds familiar. We're stealing a lot from the RTD process for their general manager selection. We're going to videotape the interviews, post them on our website along with the letters of application, and then a second online survey where stakeholders and the public can provide feedback to us on the final candidates based on those letters of application and interviews. And that public survey will be open for a week or two. If there needs to be final interviews, we'll do them, and then we will select the next District I Director the week of October 26th in time for that person to participate in the onboard training, and then they'll be sworn in with the other new directors in January 2021. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Elise, this is an important role that you and your fellow board members accept, and I'm guessing the person has to live within the district, correct?
Yep.
And what sort of person would we like to see pursuing a membership on the board? Because it's an awful lot of fun, I can tell.
and they don't have any tough issues to deal with either. So
No,
it's just
right.
fun. Butterflies and rainbows. Well, so I would like to turn that question back to this group and encourage you to provide your input into the county commissioners. I think without a doubt, we need somebody that is deeply passionate about and ideally experienced in transit, and that can not only look out for what's going on in District I and the needs that are there, but also that has a regional focus that can be helping the RTD transit system across the metro area be the best that it can be, and to work with people like Lynn and Shelley in trying to help steer the organization through these challenging times.
Thanks very much. It's a great pitch. I hope we are able to generate some great interest in this very important role. And Judy, again, thank you for your tremendous support and service over the years. She just texted or chatted that you never get bored on the RTD board. I thought that was great. Commuting Solutions has our own board vacancies, and we would love to solicit participation from anyone in our membership. So please take a look at becoming a member of the Commuting Solutions board. It again, as Elise just said, it's an important role. It's one that we think is exciting because transportation is one of the biggest challenges we face in our society. And if you are interested in this as something in your life, please consider board membership. We are particularly looking for someone from the legal field as well, as an addition to our board membership. Thanks so much, everybody. We're going to wrap things up here very quickly. One last mention of our signature event for 2020, the 4th Sustainable Transportation Summit, will be November 18. More information will be following on that. And then let me just jump right to the funner part of the meeting, door prizes. Audrey has 3, and we have 3 lucky winners. And did you just randomly select them, Audrey?
Yeah, staff from Commuting Solutions randomly picked the 3 winners who stuck with us to the bitter end, or the best end. And those winners are Dave DeNevelis. You win a $20 gift card to Jack's. Kelly Sloan, you win 2 tickets to the Butterfly Pavilion located in Westminster. And Councilmember Joan Peck, you win 2 2-hour rides on e-bikes provided by E-Bike of Colorado from Louisville.
Wow.
Being here.
Fantastic. Great swag. Thanks very much. Awesome. And Dave just said right on. Hey, everybody, thanks so much for joining us. We're getting out a little late, but we appreciate your sticking with us. We'll see you again in the 4th quarter. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.